right, lovely. Let's get started. So today, I titled the talk Beyond Exposure because we have been thinking about how we can think of these capabilities as complementary to AI and how we should shift the narrative from being machine-centric to being human-centric when thinking about the future of work. So we see in the academic literature that this machine-centric narrative has been around for quite a while, with people always being very emphatic about how AI substitutes for human labor. And we see the same mirrored in popular media, where it seems like concerns for technological unemployment keep growing, especially as AI capabilities continue to move forward. However, you know, when you look at these concerns that people have, you can narrow down these concerns into a question that says, given a set of machine capabilities, in which economically valuable tasks will humans be replaced by machine? And this emphasizes a substitution aspect of technology. However, technology not only substitutes for human labor, but it can also complement human labor. And this is the part that we want to emphasize. So instead of asking the previous question in this work, we ask, given the set of machine capabilities M, which set of human capabilities H are and will continue to be economically valuable in the face of AI? So when we started thinking about this question, we said, how can we find what capabilities are complementary? So in order to find how we can best complement AI, we look at the shortcomings that AI has based on the current paradigm of AI that we currently work with, which is based on statistical learning. So we found 5 problems or limitations that this paradigm of statistical learning and current machine learning have, which is inference with small data. For example, if you have only a handful of observations, these machine learning algorithms, regardless of how sophisticated they are, they will not be able to infer or make predictions based on just a handful of examples, while human brains are able to very quickly use just a handful of examples to make an inference of what's going on. A classical example of this is predicting eclipses, which we don't usually have a lot of data for, but because we understand the mechanics of celestial bodies, we're able to predict. Then another issue is extrapolation, where if you try to ask machines to extrapolate or predict something that is very far away from the data they were trained with, that prediction degrades the further away you want their prediction to be from the training data set. However, we know that human creativity, which is one of the main topics of discussion today, we are able to imagine things that have never existed in the past, imagine things that may never exist, or that, explore different scenarios and we don't necessarily are very bound by the examples that we see in our everyday life. Then we have multiple possible outcomes, which here particularly we're talking about issues or problems or decisions that require things like ethical judgment, where we don't know beforehand which alternative is better than the other, and we only arrive at that alternative using a very specific set of cultural norms and beliefs to guide us through that decision process. And here, machines are limited because somebody might say, well, if you have multiple options available, then just make the machine pick one at random. And we believe that many times when we encounter these particular types of decisions or issues, it's not about choosing one alternative. It's the process that led us to choosing the alternative we choose, which is the one that's holding the value. So there we need a lot of more human judgment and capabilities to be able to face these types of dilemmas. Then we have relational outcomes, which basically talks about how we build relationships with other humans. Here we emphasize things like empathy, cooperation, and trust. We build trust by interacting with other people, by repeated interactions. And even though we can interact with machines repeatedly, we can't build trust with them because that is something that is just in the realm of humans alone. And then finally, we have belief-driven decisions, which is when we need to make a decision and data does not support that particular decision, or there are no samples to support that decision. So, for example, when we're trying to make a decision based on ideas of justice or ideas of equality, but the data doesn't support the decision that we're making, this is when we encounter these kind of belief-driven decisions. One example that we like to talk about whenever we discuss this particular limitation of AI is when we wanted to make sure that women could vote. There was no historical data that said that women voting was a good idea, but we decided it was good for women to be able to vote because out of notions of justice and equality and citizenship. So it's not based on data, it's based on principle. And that's where humans shine and machines are limited in that regard. So based on these limitations, we were able to distill all of these human capabilities that we think we're able to use to overcome these particular problems, and we put them together into a framework called EPOCH. Where each letter stands for a bin of human capabilities that help us overcome or complement these limitations of AI. So E stands for empathy and emotional intelligence, and here we have things like compassion, cooperation, altruism. Then we have the P, which talks about presence and human interaction. So this is beyond just coexisting in the same space. It's all the things that happen when we're able to coexist. So it's not about going to a factory and pushing a button. It's more about the face-to-face interactions with happy humans and the serendipity that comes out of that. Then we have O for opinion and judgment. And like I mentioned, we really care and want to emphasize things like moral judgment, critical thinking. Here we include things like intuition, gut feelings, synthesis, integrity, kind of the more critical thinking abilities. Then we have C for creativity, curiosity, and imagination. It is very hard for machines to improvise in meaningful ways, also be original. I used to get a lot of pushback from people in the early days when they said, well, we have all of these large language models or generative AI that can make pictures or videos, or they can even make up songs. And that is true, they can do that, but that is a different kind of creativity because basically they're interpolating within the sample of things they were trained with. But when you want to make something truly novel, then you do require human brains to be able to do that sort of thing. And then H is for hope, vision, and leadership, where we include things like optimism, the ability to inspire others towards a goal, grit, commitment, and entrepreneurship, which are things that clearly machines don't have. So now that we have this framework, we wanted to be able to measure each of these capability bins in all of the occupations in the US. So we took a similar approach to previous work that has looked at the exposure to AI, or that has tried to quantify how much machines can substitute for human labor. So in order to take the same approach, we consider occupations as a bundle of tasks, meaning that an occupation is just made up of multiple tasks that have diverse characteristics. So we use ONIT, which is a data set that is put together by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we take the task descriptions for each occupation, and in order to be able to understand how much of each of these capabilities are required to perform each task, we embed them using a BERT-based model or a language model that allows us to represent each of these tasks as a vector of values or as a point in a multidimensional space. And then we compare these points that are the tasks with the same representations of each of the epoch capabilities. And we take the similarity between the epoch capability vectors and the task vectors for each occupation. So when we have that, then we're able to actually measure how much of each epoch capability is required to perform each task. So here I've represented each capability by a different color, and what we find because of the method that we're using is that, of course, um, each task requires at least a tiny bit of each of these capabilities, but some require more than others. And then in order to aggregate this and make it into an EPOCH score indicator per task, we use a function called CES, or a constant elasticity of substitution, which is just a function that allows us to measure how complementary these capabilities are within that task, and we are able to aggregate it at the task level. And finally, we aggregate each of these task EPOCH scores into an occupation level EPOCH score, which actually tells us how much of these human capabilities are required to do that particular occupation as described by the tasks in the data set from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So now that I've gone over the methodology, which is, I think, probably the most uninteresting part, I can show you some results. So, because we're able to measure capabilities at different resolution levels, meaning tasks and occupations, we can actually compare occupations based on how much they require for each of these capabilities. Here I have an example where the green color in the radar plot is an art therapist. So we can see that art therapists, according to their task descriptions, require a lot of hope, a lot of creativity, empathy, and judgment. But they don't necessarily require that much presence because they are able to assess some of their clients and give assignments to their clients, not being co-located with them. On the other side, we see that construction workers don't require as much empathy, hope, creativity, or opinion as art therapists, but they do require a lot of presence because they need to be on site to be able to do their job. And the other example I have in the radar plot are aerospace engineers, where we see that they're kind of in the middle between construction workers and art therapists because they require a lot of creativity when they're creating their models. They require a lot of judgment, but they require perhaps less empathy and less presence than art therapists and less presence than construction workers. And this is a more disaggregated view of each of these occupations, but we can also look at them at the EPOCH score level, where we see that art therapists, given their task descriptions, require a higher degree of EPOCH, or these human intensive capabilities, than we have the aerospace engineer and the construction worker. Then on the other plot, we can see the distributions of these EPOCH scores per major occupational group. I don't have all of them, just a sample, but we do see a pattern that we would expect, where occupations that are in the major occupational group of management, business, people that do science, require a lot of these human capabilities, and other major occupational groups like installation, maintenance, and administrative work require less of these human capabilities. So, in our findings, what we see is that between 2015 and 2025, there has been a measurable shift towards more human-intensive work, both at the task level and at the occupational level. And this is important because what the literature and what the media might have us think is that our work is becoming even more automated or more machine driven, but we actually find the opposite. The tasks that remain in the pool of human labor require more of these human capabilities that are not replaceable with AI, particularly because they complement what machines can't do. So in order to show you how we got to this claim, first, we measured the average EPOCH score of all of the tasks that make up the labor pool in the US, and we see that the EPOCH score has been growing, the average EPOCH score, between 2015 and 2025. And how is it growing? Well, if we take the tasks that were part of the human labor pool in 2015, we see that the tasks that already existed in this year, which is the orange, are somewhat distributed, kind of evenly around the EPOCH score. But we see here, even though it's 10 years ago, that the tasks that are removed they have some of them have more of a lower EPOCH score, and then some that are removed that have higher EPOCH score. Then the trend becomes clearer when we look at 2024 and 2025, and we see that the tasks that are removed from the human labor pool have lower EPOCH scores, while the tasks that are added into the labor pool or the task pool have higher EPOCH scores. So by removing tasks that don't require as much human intensity or human capabilities and adding tasks that do require them, that's how we get the average to be growing in time. We also find that not only are the tasks that are being added into the labor pool requiring more human capabilities, but also in the same time period, we find that workers reported that they were doing these tasks that require a greater amount of human intensity more frequently than they were given the baseline in 2015. So that means that if you did a task that requires a lot of human intensity once a week in 2015, in 2025, you might be doing that task twice per week. So it's not just about the composition, but also about the frequency with which workers engage with this type of work. And because this is a conference about creativity, I made this plot for you last night where instead of looking at the aggregate EPOCH score, we look at only at the creativity score and how it has changed in the tasks that are incorporated and removed from the labor pool in the US. So we do see that the pattern is perhaps less clear than the one for the EPOCH score, but even in 2025, we see that the tasks that are removed have lower scores for creativity, and the tasks that are added have higher scores for creativity. Our second finding describes how EPOCH scores are associated with past, current, and future employment projections. So what this means is that we took the EPOCH score for occupations back in, according to the labor pool and the task descriptions in 2015, and we looked at the employment change between 2024, because there's no data for 2025 yet from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and 2015. And we see that occupations that have a higher EPOCH score have positively changed in employment, meaning they have grown in the number of people employed in these occupations has grown. And occupations that tend to have a lower EPOCH score have actually decreased the number of people that are employed in these occupations. If you like stars or if you like regressions, the coefficient for this regression is statistically significant and positive. Now, if we look at data from Revelio Labs, which is a company that aggregates job postings and produces data for labor market research, they release some public statistics. And I use these statistics because the Bureau of Labor Statistics from the US hasn't been able to release jobs data since last year. So if we use the Revelio data to understand hiring patterns in January of 2026, we see that the pattern still holds, where occupations that have a higher EPOCH score are getting hired at higher rates than occupations that have a lower EPOCH score. Here, we also see that the coefficient for a regression is positive and statistically significant. And the reason why the R squared is so high and there's few dots in the plot is because these data are reported at the major occupational group level. So they're not reported at the detailed level, which is the one on the left. But we can still see the pattern. And finally, we wanted to see what is important to us is that this is predictive of future employment growth. So we looked at the occupational employment projections by the Bureau of Labor Statistics between 2024 and 2034, and we find that the pattern also holds. And we see that according to these projections, occupations that have higher EPOCH scores will continue to grow, while occupations that have lower EPOCH scores will not grow or will decrease in employment until 2034. Once again, the coefficient is positive and statistically significant, and the R squared is small because these are at the occupational level, detailed occupational level. I just realized I hadn't said before. Here we have at the detail level approximately 700 occupations that make up the US labor market. And we're not including things like the military because there's no data on that. But most of these occupations are the ones that cover most of the labor market in the US. And once again, because this is a conference about creativity, I wanted to do some analysis that emphasizes that part, although these results are not as tested as the other ones, so don't hang your hat on these specifically. But we do see that if we only look at the creativity component of occupations and we compare it with the employment projections between 2024 and 2034, we do see that creativity, occupations that require a lot of creativity, will continue to grow until 2034. Again, the pattern is less clear than if we use all of these human capabilities, but the regression is statistically significant, just the coefficient is smaller. And finally, if we compare which of these capability bins are the ones that have the highest impact in employment growth, we see that empathy, opinion, and hope have the largest coefficient and have the largest impact on the projected employment growth. Presence is the one that has the least effect. It only is statistically significant at the 0.1 level, and the coefficient is a lot smaller, and creativity is statistically significant, but the coefficient is a lot smaller. So this means that what is actually driving most of the growth are the other three capabilities, although if your occupation requires creativity, that is a good signal that it will continue to grow until 2034. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me any questions now. And I will also, if there's no questions, I can tell you a little bit about the projects that we have cooking. And yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you so much. And we do have some questions coming in. So we have one from Gary from, it was actually a little bit earlier in the talk. So he asked, what analytic method are you using for the priority vectors?
So here, what we do is because we have the different task descriptions, we use a model called all-MPNet, which basically just helps you embed all of these task descriptions into a language space so that we can compare tasks with the definitions of each of these epoch bins that we created. It is built on a BERT structure, so it does have a few tweaks that make it better than kind of the more now older language models, but it does contain tweaks that will help us better understand things like word order and dependency, like temporal dependency within the sentence. But it just allows us to be able to compare tasks with each other and allows us to compare tasks with the definitions of the epoch framework. I don't know if that answers the question.
Right. Gary said, are there follow-ups or we feel like that's enough?
Sorry?
I don't know, waiting to see if there are follow-up questions, but I don't know if there are on that one. So let me check. Okay, and let me check. And he says, yes, that's good. All right, fantastic. Thank you. All right. So then the next question we have, Deanna has a question. She mentions that it's interesting to hear that you mentioned that we can't build trust with machines. And so her view is that she disagrees she says, I think we trust a lot of machines or software now, calculators, spell checkers, applications that give us the weather based on statistical data, machines that we drive, etc. And in her view, she said, I think we do create, a clear relation of trust and commitment to those systems. So just want to get your thoughts on that comment.
Right. I do think that that is true. I mean, of course, I trust my calculator when it tells me that 2 + 2 is 4. But I think the kind of trust that we're trying to to elicit here is perhaps a little bit different. The kind of trust that can only exist between two humans. For example, the kind of trust that you require to, I don't know, build a friendship or build a relationship, right? I think lately we've been seeing a bunch of examples of how people are interacting with LLMs in ways in which it has negative consequences because they are putting that kind of trust in the machine. And that is a kind of trust that we think is still in the realm of human beings. So I think it's a little bit different between trusting that the output that the machine gives you is correct or that you know how the machine works versus trusting in this kind of more relational way.
All right. And Gary has another, I think more of a comment. Predictions based on human values, he says, are highly ambiguous in machine
Hmm.
learning, so it often screws up. So that's so machines don't work there. Yeah, and so I mean, following on when as you were talking, I was thinking the same thing about some of the interactions that people have had with machines lately, where they've kind of ascribed human characteristics to them and gotten into,
Yeah.
relationships with bad, really negative consequences a lot of the times. But on the other hand, I've also heard, even firsthand, stories of people who've found ChatGPT or one of the LLMs useful as a kind of, oh, I'm running into a problem. It's kind of nice to have a therapist, and it's kind of, I
Hmm.
can, this has been my therapist, and it's been helpful. I've heard stories like that. So how do you, yeah, how, what do we do to try to put ourselves in the right position as a society
Wow.
to, avoid some of the horrible consequences, but also find the good things? And obviously, yes, I don't think we have any questions that are, questions that have a yes, no answer. But yes, what are your thoughts on
Right.
that?
Right. Well, I think that's a very big question that is hard to answer. My personal opinion, which is perhaps a little bit different from the work that I've shown you today. Yes, have also heard from nobody I know, but read anecdotal evidence that people find ChatGPT to be helpful as a therapist. I personally find it slightly horrifying, and this is Isabella as a person, not Isabella as a research scholar. Personally, I find it a little bit horrifying, and I think that's more of a symptom that we should address collectively as humans, as opposed to, hey, let's just throw technology at the problem and hope it goes away. Um, I do think there needs to be a lot more education about how these things work because I am a firm believer that when technology is so complicated and advanced enough that it is indistinguishable from magic, people start believing things that they, shouldn't or ascribing particular patterns or things to the machines that are not really there. And that is more of a problem for us in the long term. So I think that there needs to be a lot more education in terms of how these machine works and what the limitations are and what are the right uses and also safety about using these machines, right? So I think there needs to be a lot more education on that. And now more related to the work, I think that it is wonderful to be excited about AI. I think it's a great tool. I use AI every day, either for, coding. It really helps me code a lot faster. Also, it helps me correct my grammar, stuff like that. I think it's super helpful. I'm very, very enthusiastic about potential medical breakthroughs it might bring. But I do think that we need to make sure that technology has its place without necessarily replacing humans. I think there needs to be a shift in the narrative where when we think about the future of work, we think of human workers, not what the machine will be able to do. And I think that I find the machine-centric narrative that I often encounter in these spaces um, to be a little bit worrying because I do think that we need to keep. I think work is not going away anytime soon. We've had work since the dawn of time, and work not only has like a transactional, I make a living out of this role in society. It also provides community and status and sense of belonging and motivation to a lot of people. So I don't think work is going to go away anytime soon. We just need to make sure that we use AI to transform work in a way that benefits workers, hopefully, and not increase inequality within workers. So that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I probably have a little bit more on that, but there was another question that we have from Kamani, which says, it's interesting to observe empathy and the empathy and emotional quotient built into the study involving over 700 professions. Then they say they're not sure if statistical parameters can quantify this component.
Right. Well, I mean, for sure, I do think that, language models are getting better at picking up these sorts of language based concepts. Um, what is true is that the method will only be able to measure how much of these capabilities are required based on the occupational descriptions, right? So if your job requires a lot of empathy, for example, or tasks that require empathy, but they're not described in such a way in which we can pick that up, then we will be underestimating that. This happened particularly with presence, where a couple of occupations we saw, like dentists, hairdressers, require presence because you can't be a remote dentist or a remote hairdresser. And there was no specific task saying that you have to be in the presence of your client to be able to perform your job because it's so obvious to us that we don't feel the need to write it down in the occupational description. So these jobs particularly had a lower score for presence, but that is not a flaw of the method. It's a flaw of the data that does not include this task within it. So if the emotional tasks are there, we should be able to pick it up pretty well.
Right. Gary has another comment. It kind of follows on the trust issue before. It says Roger Penrose says that consciousness is not computable, which says a lot about how much trust we should put in machines, does it? So that's Gary's comment and question, which I think you'll
Yeah,
agree with.
I
Yeah,
support it.
exactly. It's kind of what I thought you'd say on that. And if in case we can have some time for more questions as well. And maybe if we talk back a little bit more, get back to kind of the future of work. And I mean,
Hmm.
you talked about more human-centered jobs and people looking for more
Hmm.
human-centered jobs and hiring. And you're coming to us from a business school, so there
Yeah.
certainly is at least some part of the business world that's interested in efficiency, right? At almost at
Hmm.
all costs. It's like, oh, well, if I can have AI build this, what do I
Hmm.
need people for? So yeah, do you run into that in your research? Do you run into that particularly doing your research through,
Oh,
through a
yeah.
business school?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yes. The answer is yes. And also in the field of future of work, which tends to be very interdisciplinary, it's not just business school people that do research in this area. Again, the machine-centric part of it is like very strong. My co-author and I were, I think, among the first in this field of future of work to say, hey, let's think of humans, not just machines, when thinking about the future of work. I mean, I think it's like a tough fight every time I go to a conference and people are like, well, but AI is going to be able to do everything under the sun. And I'm like, okay, I guess we'll see, you know? But yeah, I do encounter that quite a lot.
Yeah, no, I imagine that that you must like so when you think about how jobs are going to evolve
Hmm.
in the future, even in as soon as the next couple of years, are there things that you kind of things that you're seeing? I mean, this is just obviously your impressions, but are there things that how do you see jobs evolving, kind of maybe in the
Hmm.
next couple of years and even beyond that, as all these forces kind of, take a little bit of effect. Some people want AI to do everything. Some people
Hmm.
are, following more philosophy that I think you share and I share and many of us here do, preserving the need for humans. So how do you see things kind of playing out if you can?
Well, I mean, I think, in the data, we do have some sort of temporal trends. We see that jobs are kind of evolving, or at least a labor pool is evolving to have more of these tasks that require human capabilities, right? So, I think that in the next couple of years, we're going to see people shifting from doing kind of the boring filing, very mechanical, repetitive tasks to more human-intensive tasks, right? At the limit, I don't know how that looks like. Another work that we're doing is trying to understand how new tasks emerge because of technology. I think that would be an interesting thing to look at. Because the other thing that tends to happen is because automation happens to the occupations and the tasks that we have today, that's why we feel like technology is encroaching on our territory because we're not yet able to see the new work in the new occupations that will emerge because of this technology. And so far, the, kind of prompt engineer or these jobs that people say that we were going to have haven't panned out as people expected them to. But technology will create new jobs. We just haven't seen them yet. So if we try to look at those, then we can also see what people are going to be doing in the future, right? And hopefully we will see that we're able to do more fulfilling work and more work that requires these capabilities that I think also might, I don't know, but I feel like if your work requires a lot of these capabilities, it might be more satisfactory to you than doing, the more clerical type of work.
No, and I think that, I mean, that's certainly in line. I mean, if you're at the intro, I said, I mean, have my own thoughts on this are along those same lines. And that's where we'd like things to go, that ideally machines are taking over the more, the drudgery, the simple tasks that just take
Yes.
time and aren't really, aren't always engaging and aren't always interesting, and frees you up to do
Yes.
the more intensive work. So I think there's something absolutely to that. And then we'll see what jobs evolve. There's probably another thing that comes up a little bit though, which is kind of interesting, just in terms of how people work and workflows. Like,
Hmm.
you know, if we reach the point where all we're doing is creative work because everything else is kind of,
Hmm.
taken over by machines, what will that feel like? Right? Like, for example, like I've had days where I sit down to try to write something and I can't.
Hmm.
I just can't get going. But then
Yeah.
I'll invariably, even in my role, have something else that can kind of, okay, this is just a little task. It doesn't really require a lot of
Hmm.
thought, but it kind of gets me going, right? It's like warming up in sports, right? It's like you kind of
Hmm.
just, okay, it's something. And then maybe I can more easily get back to something creative and find a little bit more of a spark.
Hmm.
So, one other open question is just sort of how do people's personal workflows in that sense and evolve in a world, if we get to that world where you really don't have to think about the sort of little tasks anymore, and you're free to think, how much, how much can you do of that over time, and
Right.
are there other values to some of the other things, and what does that get replaced? Maybe that gets replaced with a walk. I do well if I go take a walk too. That
Same.
works. So maybe that's
Yeah.
how that ends up. But
Yeah,
it's
no,
hard to
I think
know.
I saw some research earlier last year that tried to ask a question along the same lines. And what they found was that in occupations where you are asked to do kind of these more creative, thinking intensive tasks, a lot, like most of the time, workers get burnt out more. I don't remember the title of the paper. I saw it on Archive, but I thought it was very interesting because normally we think, oh, the more creative my job gets, that's amazing. But
Yeah.
also you need to do other kinds of tasks too.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting balance, right? Because I mean, you certainly get the inspiration from the creative work too, but
Yeah,
there's the agony as well. Sometimes you just can't get your thoughts out there, and it's, you've got to figure out how am I going to do this, and
sure.
it's always a balance, and I mean, I think that's kind of how it goes. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves. And then when you talk about the human machine complementarity, then do you see, and if we talked about that really fully, yeah, like, how do you see the machines fostering creativity then,
Hmm.
as opposed to, there's the freeing up people, which I agree with, but then there's also some of the other ways in which, AI can maybe help people get going in those ways, or help people, be more creative. Do you see that as well?
Yeah, I do see that. I mean, I see it in my own work, right? Where, for example, I'm thinking of a research question that I want to answer, and I'm like, how can I answer this? And maybe I say, hey, ChatGPT, help me brainstorm. How can I answer this question? And then it will show me a method that maybe I didn't know existed. And I'm like, oh, so if I use this method, oh, maybe I can answer this other question, or maybe I can do this on top of this, and then that sparks creativity. So it's more like because it allows me to synthesize a lot of information that I don't necessarily have in my head, it allows me to piece things together more efficiently, and that's where my creativity comes in. So I think some of that would work for other folks as well.
Yeah. No, it sounds like it would. I mean, it does sound, one of the things that I know I'll have to continue to deal with is you're coming at this from a perspective of an experienced professional already, right? So you're able to take a look at, here's what ChatGPT says or Gemini says, here's what I think of it, right?
Right.
Yeah, this is really helpful. Yeah, this, I don't, the same way you might when someone made a suggestion, but you don't have to be polite, right? So that's kind of the
Right.
difference, right? I don't like that, come up with something else.
Hmm.
Um, but then, there's an open question too about people who are just starting out and how they can start to better differentiate and
Yeah.
start to get a feel for, and I think from the education side, we might want people to put people in positions to, to do things that help them learn, that help to just, you know, form their own body of knowledge and their own critical
Yeah.
thinking skills to evaluate, like, yeah, this is worth pursuing, this is not worth pursuing. And because those are
Yeah.
decisions that you'll make, we all make every day, right? Many, many
Mhm.
times, something comes across your mind. Yep. They're always right. I don't always make the right ones, but we make informed decisions based on our experiences that we've
Yeah, for
had to this
sure.
point.
For sure. I think I was in a discussion at a think tank in Belgium last year, and there they were suggesting things like, oh, we should have things like just like pilots have flight simulators, we should have something similar for other occupations. I thought it was, it's probably hard to implement, but it's not terrible. It's not a terrible idea. I mean, I think it would be good. So that's one thing. And then the other thing about how we build this kind of expertise by doing our work. And this is not an answer. This is just an observation I had because I was looking at the average EPOCH score of entry-level jobs per cohort divided by like between 1970 and today, and it has decreased. So workers in time seem to be entering the workforce in like less creative, less human intensive occupations in time, which also, even though it doesn't have to do with technology, is another force that we need to think about. How are we going to get the people to learn these capabilities so they can grow in their career, which I think links to what you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. So it's interesting that you're seeing more of a need for human thoughts. It's, for human-centered jobs, but you're seeing people enter so the entry-level jobs is where you're seeing people that are still
Yes,
doing to very,
the
very even
first
more basic
job that
jobs than
people
ever.
have when they enter the workforce in the 1970s had a lot more epoch than in
Yes.
2019. That's the last year I had in my data.
Got it. So much, much less, yeah, much right. So much less human. The first jobs are much less human in
Yes,
that way. Got it. Much less human oriented in that sense. Okay. Yeah, and that's something to, very much to keep in mind and figure out where we go from here on that. And yeah, that's a big challenge. Did you have sort of explanations for sort of how that evolved over time and how we got to where we are? I have some thoughts, but I'm just
so
curious to see.
I was looking into it for a different conference that I have to go to about youth unemployment, and I wanted to look at it with respect to that famous paper, The Canaries in the Coal Mine, which I think the insights from that are, a little bit overblown by external folks, not by the researchers themselves. And I looked into that precisely because of this conference. And I guess the only explanation I can think right now without doing any further analysis is that we have specialized ourselves into oblivion, basically. In the past, people didn't specialize as much, and you also look at the career transitions that people did. So if you think of a job and you see where the other, after that job, which other jobs they went to, in the past the fan was a lot bigger. Now it's less big. So we're
Yeah.
just specializing ourselves more and more, which can have economic returns, but it also makes it harder for you to escape your current career path, right?
No, absolutely. And especially in a time now when things are with AI changing, in a lot of ways much more rapidly, the theory is I think that people need to be more prepared to,
Exactly.
it's less about knowing this particular specialized skill that's going to change anyway, and more about how do you attack new skills and how do you handle the decisions that you have to make. So
Exactly.
all that seems particularly relevant here. Well, that's, I think, a great place to wrap up. So, Isabel, thank you so much for spending the
Thank
time with us
you.
today and really enjoyed this.